Now, the corruption trial against former President Jacob Zuma and French arms company Thales will begin on the 17th of May. After 18 years of legal maneuvering, Zuma's legal battles have not been without political implications for both the ANC and the country's political landscape in general. To help us make sense of some of this is political analyst Professor Dirk Coetzee, who joins me alongside University of Cape Town Associate Professor Richard Calland. Gentlemen, a very good evening to you. Thank you for your time. Let me start with you, Professor Calland. As we look at what happened and what transpired in court today, a date was set, but as we assessed what was happening outside the courthouse, there was not a single supporters, no roads were closed, and none of Zuma's bust-in supporters came in. A far cry from those mobile stages and the sound systems and the big crowds from 2018 and 2019. Is it fair to judge that matter, even though the former president wasn't in court, to perhaps assess his political influence on the political landscape?
I think, Bo, it's a good question to pose, and I think it is a good indicator because you mentioned 2018, 2019. One needs to also go back much further in Mr. Zuma's very checkered up and down political and legal career. 2004, the rape trial and the crowds there behind him, and the way he resurrected his support when he hit rock bottom after, of course, President Mbeki fired him as deputy president of the country in 2005, a moment that we now look back at and recognize as being a very serious moment in terms of what it unleashed. It unleashed the tsunami, as someone later called it, which led to Polokwane, Zuma winning the election for the ANC presidents, and then later becoming the president of the country, and then the 10 lost years and state capture. All of that, by the way, goes straight back to its original origin, which is the corruption that he now faces charges for in relation to the arms deal back in 1999, 2000, the last century, 21 years ago. It's an extraordinary history, and it shows that Mr. Zuma has been a very skillful user of our legal system to avoid justice, despite his regular protestations that he looks forward to his day in court.
What did you make of those silent roads, Professor Coetzee?
Well, I think this is a continuation of what we've seen in the past. The last number of times that President Zuma appeared in court in Pietermaritzburg specifically, this was the case. The ANC tends to call on the ANC now supporters not to support court cases. They said the same also to in the case of Magashule at Bloemfontein, although there were then more supporters there. I think what is also maybe one of the contributing factors is what was the complication in Bloemfontein, and that is that with the lockdown regulations now, it's almost impossible to have meetings around that will constitute political meetings associated with court appearances. And I think the Zuma supporters know about it or understand it also. But it is, in the end, still a reflection on President Zuma that those big crowds of the past were not there. And it is, I think, an indication that President Zuma's support, together with that, although it sounds like a contradiction, together with Magashule in a sense, is in decline, that their support base in public is not the same as in the past.
Now, Professor Calland, let me just move to you. You speak about a skillful user of our legal system. What is the former president's strategy right now? Is he trying to get his side of the story across, or just exploiting his supporters when it comes to this matter?
Well, I think that after 21 years, he is finally running out of legal runway. His legal room for maneuver, I think, is really closing down, and the net is finally closing around him. So one sees both in terms of his fight against the Zondo Commission and today's news that the Zondo Commission Secretary, Professor Masala, has tabled or has launched those proceedings in the Constitutional Court for contempt of court with a very hard-hitting application against Mr. Zuma, really calling on the court to be very firm in its dealing with the former president. facing, of course, in May, in 2 months' time, the corruption charges in relation to the arms deal. Finally, that trial looks like it will go ahead. Of course, even if he's convicted there will be appeals, no doubt, down the road. But I think overall, Paul, to answer your question, Mr. Zuma is now moving back into the political space because that legal space is closing down on him. Therefore, his real strategic option, I think, is only to try and disturb the political scene, to cause disturbance within the ANC and to create some kind of bargaining space for him within that. What that looks like, I really don't know, because I think that with Ramaphosa at the helm of the ANC, I think the ANC's leadership will simply say, well, the law must take its course. It must run its course. We're not going to interfere with that. We've seen what happened when presidents interfere in the rule of law and the criminal justice system in the past. We're not going to do that. And it certainly wouldn't serve Mr. Ramaphosa's agenda or his political prospects were he to interfere.
Professor Coetzee, we're listening here to Professor Callan speaking about how the legal space is closing down. What then does this defiance mean when it comes to his power within the ANC and the impact on the party's leadership?
Well, I think the fact that President Zuma isn't the president anymore is a very important factor in terms of his power within the ANC. Any person who is the ANC's president and at the same time the national president has huge institutional power. This is the person who can take the final decisions on many aspects. President Zuma does not have any of those powers. So purely on that basis, there's a huge difference between President Ramaphosa and President Zuma. And therefore, he does not have that influence in the ANC anymore. He cannot take decisions and guide the direction, for example, of the National Executive Committee on important issues within the ANC. At the same time, what he can rely on is now basically his personal reputation, his history, his legacy in the ANC. And I think what is happening now with these court cases, multiple court cases now, actually it can go back to 2005, is that these court cases are gradually eroding his personal legacy within the ANC now. And I think this, what we are seeing now with this lack of support or public endorsement of him is exactly that. At the same time, President Ramaphosa, in my view, which is not the general view, is actually gaining more support within the ANC. He has consolidated his position in government to a large extent. And I think he's doing it more and more within the ANC also. So the playing field is not equal or level between the two of them. And I think this is what we are seeing. And my understanding is that the same is actually happening with Ace Magashule. So this is certainly a decline, and it is symptomatic of the fact that President Zuma is really now consolidating, President Ramaphosa is consolidating his position as the sitting president with all the levers of power of government and actually the ANC available to him.
As we listen in and you speak about political power, Professor Callan, moving to you to perhaps weigh in here, could this then be an indicator of why that Tea Party was so essential?
Well, I think you're onto something there, because clearly over a period of time, the relationship between what some people call the fight back faction or the radical economic transformation faction within the ANC, if it deserves the title of faction, I'm not sure it does, but take for a moment that it does. That faction, its relationship to Malema and Malema's wing of the EFF, which I think is also looking for an exit strategy of its own. And that's a political exit away from the kind of glass ceiling that the EFF have hit. Malema would welcome perhaps an opportunity to come back into the ANC if the time was ripe and if he thought that there was an opportunity for him to acquire power there. So that's always been a very interesting space to watch in the last couple of years. And I think that what Mr. Zuma was doing by having that little tea party with Mr. Malema a couple of weeks ago was trying to ratchet up the pressure. He's trying to put pressure on the ANC. I think he's trying to create division within the ANC, because by creating division with the ANC, he, again, come back to my point, creates some kind of political bargaining power for himself within the ANC, hoping that the ANC leadership will find a way of finding to use the old euphemism, a political solution to his problem. They found a political solution, let us not forget, back in 2009, when the corruption charges, which he now faces in May, were originally dropped unlawfully, the court later said, but they were dropped then as a result of a political settlement, essentially within the ANC and brokered with government. But as Professor Coetzee rightly points out, at that time, Mr. Zuma was the president of the ANC, and he was about to become the president of the country. Now he has none of that political power or possibility in front of him.
And Professor Coetzee, you made mention of Ace Magashule there, and we know, as we perhaps, the strategy here was to avoid prosecution by all means. How are ANC factions now working to ensure that the Zuma agenda is felt?
Well, I'm not sure how they are going to do that. You know, on the one hand, I think that the choice has become between two options. The one option is the political option, or the political solution, as Professor Calland referred to, and that is the preference of President Zuma as well as Magashule. Both are using more or less the same argument in their early appearances in court or at the Zondo Commission, is that they are political victims. That they are the targets of political strategies, and therefore, in their mind, there must be also a political solution. On the other hand, President Ramaphosa, I think, is committed to the legal solution or the legal approach that is being spearheaded by Judge Zondo and the courts. And there's actually no middle ground between the two, because once you try to have a bit of a political intervention, the political solution requires that you make concessions and that there's compromises. And the moment you do that, you start to water down the principles on which the legal system is supposed to be based. So it's either or. It's a zero-sum situation in my view. And there's very, very little of a middle ground of how the different groups can come together. So in the end, the ultimate is a test of which one is the strongest, which one has the most resources, the most political or the biggest constituency to rely on in the ANC, and that one will prevail. I think it's the first time in the ANC that they cannot use a political solution anymore, because that will be seen in public as too much of a concession by the Ramaphosa side. And I don't think he can afford it at this stage.
Very well. Thank you so much for your time, political analyst Professor Dirk Coetzee, joining me alongside the University of Cape Town's Associate Professor Richard Calland. But gentlemen, before I say goodbye to you, Professor Calland, we also know that the Commission has put out some sort of action when it comes to news of an arrest of the former president. You were at the State Capture Commission of Inquiry. What do you make of this action that's now been taken by the Zondo Commission?
Well, as I said, I think in my first answer to your first question, the Commission has really taken off its gloves and has really thrown down the gauntlet now, because I think the Commission has been greatly irked. And Deputy Chief Justice Zondo is clearly a man of considerable dignity and patience, but it's been sorely tested, I think, by Mr. Zuma's conduct over a 2-year period. And most recently, of course, with his, I think, scandalous attacks upon Deputy Chief Justice Zondo, on the integrity of the Commission, on the integrity of the Constitutional Court. So Mr. Zuma is now in a corner, and I think he is going to be hoisted by his own legal petard here, in the sense that the Commission is now fiercely pushing the Constitutional Court to take strong action. It's arguing for a 2-year prison sentence. The papers that were filed in support of its application of contempt of court at the Constitutional Court today by the Secretary of the Commission, Professor Masala, are very hard-hitting. He does not mince his words. He says that the former president is under high duty to conduct himself with dignity. He's failed that. He's made scurrilous attacks, and he's undermined the integrity of the judiciary and the rule of law. And therefore, they are arguing that there should be a very severe penalty for Mr. Zuma's contempt.
And let me thank you for your time. Gentlemen, thank you for joining us on News at Prime here on Newzroom Africa. Political analyst Professor Dirk Coetzee alongside University of Cape Town Associate Professor Richard Calland.